You'll probably watch this entire video thinking it's about someone else. But I need to warn you, the 10 signs I'm about to show you are not about extreme behaviors, they're not about children, and they're not about anything you've seen before when it comes to autism. They're about things you do today, perhaps even right now, and have never associated with anything. Things that seem normal, that everyone around you also sees as normal. But when you put them together, they tell a completely different story about how your brain works. If you've ever felt exhausted for no reason, different without explanation, or wrong without ever having done anything wrong, the next few minutes were made for you. Have you ever looked someone in the eyes during a conversation and felt as if you were touching something you shouldn't? As if that contact was too invasive, too intense, almost painful. Many people with autistic traits develop, without even realizing it, what specialists call false eye contact, looking at the forehead, the nose, or a point between the eyes. It works so well that no one around them notices any difference at all. The problem is that this silent adaptation is exactly what makes masked autism so difficult to identify, even for the person themselves. The brain has found a shortcut to appear normal in social situations, but the cost of that is an exhaustion that builds up over years without a name, without an explanation. And if you recognized yourself in that feeling just now, it might be worth paying attention to what comes next. Someone asks you a simple question and you hear everything clearly, but the meaning takes a few seconds to arrive. It's as if the audio and the subtitles are slightly out of sync. You smile, nod, and only somewhere in the background of your mind does your brain finally process what was said. This is one of the most invisible signs of autism in adults, precisely because the person heard everything they just needed a bit more time to understand it. People who experience this are often labeled as distracted, slow, or inattentive, and carry that label for years without knowing the real cause. In high-functioning autism, this processing delay often goes unnoticed because the person has learned to mask it with strategic questions, well-timed laughter, or vague responses that buy time. But internally, it's like trying to watch a film with the buffer constantly freezing, exhausting in a way that's difficult to explain. Have you ever bumped into the corner of a table for the 10th time in the same day and wondered how someone can be so clumsy? Or grabbed a glass too tightly, knocked something over by accident, misjudged the distance between your hand and a shelf? This has a name, and it's not lack of attention, it's dyspraxia. An autistic trait that directly affects how the brain communicates with the body in space. As if your internal map of your own body is always one step behind reality. What makes this sign so overlooked is that on the surface it seems like just a personality trait. Oh, they're just clumsy. But in adults with undiagnosed autism, this coordination difficulty can have a real impact on self-esteem, especially when it comes alongside sensory hypersensitivity. Because the body is already in a constant state of alert, and every stumble becomes yet another piece of evidence that something isn't working properly. But the challenge goes beyond the physical, and the next sign shows that in a way you've probably never associated with autism. Some people look at a mixed plate rice, beans, salad all together and feel a genuine physical discomfort, almost like an involuntary rejection reflex. It's not fussiness, it's not stubbornness, and it's definitely not a childish thing. It's sensory hypersensitivity applied to food, and it's far more common in adults with undiagnosed autism than most people realize. The wrong texture and unexpected consistency, two flavors that shouldn't mix, all of this can trigger a genuinely physical response in the body. What complicates things is that this autistic trait often leads to social judgment from an early age. The child who wouldn't eat certain foods becomes the adult who is difficult with food, or who makes things complicated at restaurants and learns to feel ashamed instead of understanding the cause. In masked autism, many people develop elaborate strategies to hide this selectivity, such as eating beforehand or discreetly rearranging their plate. It's yet another example of how the autistic brain works twice as hard to make it seem like everything is fine, when in reality, it's just coping. If you have the habit of walking on your tiptoes at home, or did so as a child, and were constantly corrected without really understanding why this detail deserves more attention than it seems. Tiptoe walking is a form of sensory self-regulation. The body, completely instinctively, reduces contact with the ground to minimize the stimulation coming through the soles of the feet. For people with sensory hypersensitivity, simply stepping on a cold, rough or textured surface can be uncomfortable enough for the brain to find this adjustment on its own. What few people realize is that this behavior doesn't necessarily disappear in adulthood, it just becomes more subtle, more controlled, more masked. The person stops doing it in public, learns that it's not normal, but continues doing it at home without even noticing. In studies on autism in adults, tiptoe walking appears as one of the most consistent and least discussed physical signs, precisely because it seems too small to take seriously. But once you start connecting the dots, you realize none of these signs exist in isolation, and the next one might be the most recognizable of all. Have you ever started talking about a subject you love, and before you realized 40 minutes had passed while you explained every detail, every curiosity, every layer of that topic, while the other person politely tried to find a moment to breathe? This is what the autistic community calls info dumping, and it's one of the most genuine and misunderstood expressions of autistic traits. It's not a lack of social awareness, it's the brain operating in its most natural mode. When something sparks real interest, it goes deep. The problem is that the world rarely has patience for that level of depth. People who infodump are often labeled as boring, obsessive, or the one who only talks about one thing and learn to hold back, to summarize, to pretend the topic doesn't matter that much. In high-functioning autism, this behavior is one of the first to be socially masked because the rejection it creates hurts in a very particular way. But here's a shift in perspective. The people who changed the world the most were precisely those who couldn't stop thinking deeply about one thing, and the next sign is closely tied to that intensity. There are situations most people brush off with a simple "that's just how it is," and you simply can't. An inconsistency in rules, someone being treated differently for no reason, a small injustice everyone ignored, but that stays in your mind for days. For those with autistic traits, the sense of justice isn't just a moral value, it's almost a neurological need. The autistic brain tends to process rules and patterns in a very literal and consistent way, which makes any deviation genuinely disturbing. What complicates life for those with undiagnosed autism is that this trait often creates unnecessary conflict at work, in relationships, in social situations, where the unspoken game is to pretend everything is fine. The person is seen as inflexible, dramatic, or difficult, when in reality they're just responding to something their brain has registered as clearly wrong. In masked autism, learning to let things go becomes a conscious and exhausting effort because it's not natural, it's a performance. Have you ever found yourself mentally repeating a phrase you heard from a film, a song, a conversation without being able to explain why it keeps looping in your mind? Or quietly repeating a word or sound simply because its texture feels satisfying? This is echolalia, and it doesn't only exist in the way most people imagine a child repeating words out loud. In adults with undiagnosed autism, echolalia is often internal, silent, completely invisible to others. What makes this trait so fascinating is that it acts as an emotional regulation tool, repeating a familiar phrase, a comforting sound, or even an entire scene calms the nervous system in a way that's hard to describe. In masked autism, Many people use functional echolalia without even knowing it has a name, like internally repeating what someone said to process it better, or murmuring lines from films in moments of stress. It's the brain finding rhythm where the world feels too chaotic. Have you ever felt a real emotional weight when throwing away an old object, not because of its material value, but because it seemed to carry a story, a presence, almost a feeling? Or caught yourself wondering how a product on a supermarket shelf feels for not being chosen? It may sound poetic, but for many adults with undiagnosed autism, this experience is completely literal and genuinely intense. Hyperempathy towards inanimate objects is an autistic trait that stems from the same deep sensitivity that makes the autistic brain so unique. It doesn't filter what deserves emotional connection. And now that you've seen all 10 signs, the question is, how many did you recognize in yourself? What if I told you that some of the most ordinary habits in your life, the way you sit, the difficulty with eye contact, the feeling that the world is too loud, too fast, too intense, are not character flaws, lack of manners, or simply who you are? What if all of that had a real neurological explanation, with a name, with research, with a community? Autism in adults is far more common than official numbers suggest, and most people living with it have no idea.